I believe the reason he couldn't kill Jonathan, I think Jonathan slapped the spear he threw at him aside, or yanked it away or something. He tried to kill Jonathan with the spear. He tried to kill David. And the difference between David and Jonathan and Saul was that these men were very skilled in battle and they didn't die easy. But the main reason that David didn't get struck with a spear, if you can imagine being in a position where you're playing a harp and having somebody throwing a weapon at you, it's not exactly the best kind of a situation to avoid getting killed. And so God certainly protected him, but David probably whopped him on the head with a harp and left. Probably didn't whop him on the head with a harp, but I like that part, and so I put it in there for fun to see if you're awake. Well, so David goes out of his presence, and the Bible says about King Saul, he was wroth, and he sought from that day forward to kill him. Is there a contrast here? Well, let's look at David's attitude when he realizes that Saul's not his friend. When David comes to the understanding that Saul's not his friend, I just want to look at his attitude towards Saul. The Bible says in verse 13, verse 13, Saul wanted him out of the house. Saul removed him from him, made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. I want to point out to you that when David was greatly wronged by the individual who in all the world should have most appreciated him, then nothing in his life changed. And let's pause here a moment, because this is more than just a story. This is application for us. Let me ask you what happens when things come into your life that aren't fair. What happens when something occurs in your life that isn't fair? I mean, we know when we're wrong, don't we? If we're honest about it. And sometimes we're not honest about it, and we have problems because of that lack of honesty, and we end up being bitter instead of getting right about being wrong. But sometimes we're not wrong. And I have to say to you that at this point in David's life, you cannot say, well, he should have or he shouldn't have. He should have done exactly what he did, and yet he was wronged. Here he is trying to serve a man who is actually sitting in his seat. And he's trying to be faithful to the Lord, and he's trying to be faithful to the Lord's anointed, the king. And the king tries to kill him. And it's not fair. It's not right. And I can imagine you getting a little stewed up and relating an incident that's occurred in your life that's similar to that. You didn't do wrong. I mean, I did this for this person, and I intended it for their good, and I went to them and I sacrificed everything I had, and I put my character and my reputation on the line, and I had no kind of personal motive. I was just trying to do the right thing. And then I want to say sometimes after the then you have a then I. And so I went home, and I've never ever since then. Huh? It's happened in churches sometimes, hasn't it? I went there and those people judged me. And when they did that, I went home and I've never returned there again, and I'll never step foot in a church again for the rest of my life. That's what David would have done, isn't it? No. The Bible says David behaved himself wisely. Saul tried to kill him, and David behaved himself wisely. Christian, let me ask you where you're at. Where are you at spiritually? When an individual does wrong against you, as Saul certainly did to David, what is your response? Things ought to be the same in your life. I think David cried. There are times in the book of Psalms where he said all day long, or he said, I've cried all night long. Mostly it was about his own sin. He said, I've made my bed to swim in tears. David was a tender-hearted man. He loved the Lord and he loved his king, and it hurt his feelings. King Saul tried to kill him. But it didn't change his attitude, and it did not change his action one iota. David was the same man after the spear was thrown at him twice as he was when he was playing his harp for King Saul. Do you know that you'll not stand before God and answer for the sin which was committed against you? God won't require you to make right someone else's wrong. And so do you know you don't have to? You don't have to. You know, King David, and he was the rightful king. And we can refer to him as king David could have tried to right the wrong of King Saul. What better time to set himself up as king? He threw a spear at me, I'll stick it in him. I'll show him how to throw spears. The rest of his life, Saul chased him, pursued him, hunted him like an animal. And he never threw a spear back. That's admirable to look at, but it's hard to live, isn't it? It's easy to look at and admire, but it's very difficult to live. And my friend, I want to say to you, you won't be a man after God's own heart. You won't be a lady after God's own heart unless you learn to love, serve, forgive, and you live just the same when wrong is committed against you as you ever did before. That's David's attitude. He behaved himself wisely before. He behaved himself wisely afterward. It's been said, and I don't remember by who it's been quoted many times, but I think it was Dr. Bob Jones Sr. who would say the test of a man's character is what it takes to stop him. It certainly is a great test on David's character, isn't it? Let me ask you a question. Given similar circumstances, and you probably have been given them, would you fail or pass the test? Would it be said about you, they were serving the Lord, they were behaving themselves wisely, they were wronged, and after that they were serving the Lord and they were behaving themselves wisely? Or could it be said about you, you know what, they did right until. You know, they never started that until. Maybe you'd say, Pastor, I never did this until. I never began until. I was just fine until. And I want to say to you, David was just fine before, and he was just fine after, because he was right with God. No man can keep you from being right with God. And you can blame all you want to. And you can say this person did and that person did and they shouldn't have and they didn't have the right. And I have to say to you, nothing can stand between you and the Lord. Nothing stood between David. So here's Saul, who, in contrast to David, has rebelled. Consequence of it is, now he's doing battle with God. And I want to remind you of the contrast between these two individuals. We probably won't be able to make all the points I wanted to this morning for sake of time. But there's a contrast here. Here is an individual who has an example that he can look at. Do you know if Saul had had the right spirit, he could have sat there and looked at David, who he was jealous of, who from that day forward that he'd heard about Saul slaying his thousands and David slaying his 10,000s, he'd marked him and began to watch him and think, this is the guy God's made king. Do you know he could have sat there and thought, you know what, there's a day when I would have been best friends with David. There's a day when it wouldn't have hurt my feelings at all that people said about him that he was a greater warrior than I am. There was a day when I didn't even want to be king. And you know what? Today, I ought to just pass this throne over to the person to whom God has chosen. And I ought to serve. You could serve a guy like David. How many of us would give up our place to someone whom God had chosen who was better qualified than ourselves? How many of us would do that? I've seen preachers kill churches by trying to hold on to a pulpit to whom God perhaps has given a more qualified individual. And they say, it's mine. I've got a right. Oh, God help us. God help us not to be a Saul in that perspective, from that attitude. David wanted to be right with Saul. It's interesting when Saul's daughter Merab was offered in verse 17 and verse 20, or verse 19, it came to pass, or verse 18, David said unto Saul, who am I and what's my life or my father's family in Israel that I should be son-in-law to the king? David, though he had the right, hey, do you think David knew what happened when Samuel anointed him to be king of Israel? He did. He knew what it meant. But he also knew God hadn't worked out the circumstances for it to happen. And he said, you know what, who am I to marry the king's daughter? And Saul's daughter Michal loved King David.